Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Israel and the Gulf States Toward a Historic Peace. Here's Alan Schneider, Director of B'nai B'rith International's World Center, Jerusalem.
Shalom and welcome to today's program. This webinar is the fourth installment of B'nai B'rith's signature Expert Analysis Global Perspective series. This conversation will focus on Israel's developing reconciliation and growing relationship with the Gulf states. And our timing could not have been more propitious. The Abraham Accord, the historic normalization agreement between the UAE and Israel, brokered by President Trump and his team, was initialed last week and is due to be formally signed soon. This is the newest element in the ever-changing, complex Middle East equation and has set imaginations on fire about what the region might look like if a comprehensive peace breaks out. We are honored to have a distinguished guest for this very timely discussion. Dr. Michal Yaari is a lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Open University. She is an expert on Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. Particularly relevant to today's conversation, Dr. Yaari has published several academic articles regarding the quiet revolution in Saudi-Israeli relations. With the help of our guest, we will dive into the complexities of the Israel-Gulf states relationship, both in the public arena and behind the scenes, as well as the dynamics vis-a-vis Iran and the Palestinians. We appreciate you being with us, Dr. Yaari, and I'd like to throw out the first question to you. What, in your view, are the reasons for the recent change in relations between Israel and the Gulf states?
First, I would like to thank you for hosting me today. In order to understand the nature and the extent of the new era in the relations between Israel and the Gulf states, we have to go back in time. There are several elements that came together to bring about this change. First, the increased Iranian threat. Since 2011, the outbreak of the Arab Spring, Iranian influence in a weak Arab state has increased, especially in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. Moreover, Iran was getting closer to developing a nuclear weapon despite UN sanctions. In order to reduce the Iranian influence in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were unwillingly forced to adopt an assertive approach that diverged from the generally cautious security policy. Second, the fallout from the Arab Spring further worsened the security environment due to terror organizations such as ISIS and Hezbollah. Third, and very, very important, is the shared perception of Israel and Saudi Arabia that they can no longer rely on their long-standing strategic patron, the United States. Those states, both Israel and the Saudis' fate in the Obama administration was severely shaken by its response to the Arab Spring. The message that came out of Washington was very clear. We, the American people, can't spare any more of our boys to die in wars that are not ours. It's time for you to solve your own problems. That was especially the case regarding Syria. But the main issue was, of course, the US policy towards Iran. In the Saudis' eyes, Obama signed an agreement with our biggest enemy. Obama, in the Saudis' eyes, chose the devil himself over a reliable ally. As a result, the Saudi kingdom started to adopt more assertive and activist strategy towards Iran and its proxies. Most importantly, this was the moment when Saudi Arabia understood very clearly that it needs to look for other allies who have the necessary capabilities and intentions to deter Iran. And one of the obvious options was, of course, Israel. Meaning, Israel is no longer part of the problem, but actually part of the solution. That means that Israel and Saudi Arabia have been drawn together primarily by the shared perception of the threat posed by the Iranian regime. Under President Trump, relations between Washington and Riyadh improved dramatically, but the Saudis have good reasons to remain concerned given Trump's unpredictable policy and his tendency to cut back US commitment abroad. Fourth, national interests versus Palestinian interests. Recently, cracks emerged in the traditionally hostile Saudi discourse about Israel, alongside those that continue to reject improving relations with Israel. Other voices are calling for pragmatism on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This is especially the case when it comes to Saudi-Israeli security cooperation in deterring Iran. Having said that, the connection between Riyadh and Jerusalem are still perceived by elements in the Saudi public as a betrayal of the Palestinian interest, which plays into the hands of the regime opponents. Fifth, a new generation of leaders means new perspective. This new generation of pragmatic leaders in the Gulf states, especially in Saudi Arabia, are more focused on internal issues. They appreciate the benefits of cooperating with Israel, even if time is not right for full normalization. Therefore, they hold more pragmatic policy towards Israel. But the most interesting conclusion is that the formula of territories for peace is no longer exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that opening answer. I'd like to bear down for a minute on the agreement itself, what they're calling the Abraham Accord between Israel and the UAE, before we return to Saudi Arabia again. And I'd like to have your opinion of the agreement itself. Was it anticipated that that this would happen? I mean, we know that there were relations for quite some time between Israel and the UAE. So on the one hand, was it anticipated? And do you expect that the floodgates now will open and other states in the Gulf and maybe outside the Gulf will sign some sort of a treaty, a peace agreement with Israel?
Definitely. None of us was surprised by this agreement. We expected it would come sooner or later. It was quite obvious that normalization between Israel and the UAE is only a matter of time. And hopefully this would be the case also with Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Bahrain. But I like to focus on what I see would be the strengths of the agreement. What would make this agreement, whether it's with the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Oman, what would make this agreement a long-lasting agreement? And this is extremely important, as I see it anyway. And I think in order for this agreement between Israel and the UAE or Saudi Arabia to be a long-lasting agreement, whether it's normalization agreement or peace agreement, whatever you would call it, I think there should be two key elements. The first one is flexibility. What do I mean by that? If we take, for example, the US-Saudi relations, the US-Saudi relations over the years were based on a very basic formula. You can say the formula was Gulf oil in return for a US strategic umbrella. But in the last decade, the US is no longer dependent on the Gulf oil, but it hasn't changed the nature of the agreement. On the contrary. Why? Due to the ability of both sides, both states, to expand their common interests. In the case of Israel and the UAE, or Israel and Saudi Arabia, it has to be able to adapt itself to ever-changing reality in the region. For example, what if tomorrow the regime in Iran suddenly collapses and is replaced by a more pragmatic regime? We must take into account that in the dynamic reality of the Middle East, the nature and intensity of threat can change. Therefore, in my opinion, it would be a mistake on the part of Israel if it bases its relations with the Gulf states and with Saudi Arabia in particular, mostly on fighting common enemies. This is an important and significant element in the relations, but it's not enough to establish a long-term and solid relations. The agreement must be based on more than the premise of the enemy of my enemy is my friend or common enemy. It has to be more diverse. It is true that the cooperation between the Gulf states and Israel started in places that there was no other choice, okay? Cooperating against common enemy. But in order for this agreement to be a long-lasting agreement, we should move to cooperation where there are other choices. Israel is not the only state with cutting-edge technology, but the Gulf states should choose to cooperate with Israeli companies because they believe this is the right thing to do. And the second element should be a deeper understanding that not all the conflicts can be resolved. Israel and the Gulf states have to realize that they may have to agree to disagree, especially regarding the Palestinian problem.
Well, I mean, you touched upon U.S., the United States, and possible change of policy by the U.S. in the region. And I wonder if you could expand on that, looking into the future. In other words, how this agreement actually might, and particularly if it expands, might change the structure, the geopolitical structure in the region, and how the U.S. might fit in that case. And kind of as a follow-up, we've been hearing in the last 24 hours that the U.S. might be selling F-35s to the UAE, and that this is part of the agreement. We've heard from the Israeli Prime Minister and Israeli spokesman that this is not part of the agreement, and the U.S. has reiterated its promise to maintain Israel's qualitative edge. But nonetheless, I wonder again here, as one of the pieces in this puzzle, how that might affect the region.
Okay, so first of all, I really hope that that the US won't sell this F-35 because it's not the right thing to do, if I may say that. But regarding the US, I must say there's a great irony in the fact that over the years, US put a lot of effort into bringing the two sides together without much success. And the relations between Israel and the Gulf states became closer due to the failed policy of Obama in the Middle East. And now Trump is taking the credit, meaning this agreement was made possible by Obama's failed policy, if I may say. You mentioned the arms deal, and I must say this is part of the advantages for the UAE and maybe even for Saudi Arabia, because if I might say, I think that in the last several years, the Gulf states are in a process of trying to improve their image in the American eyes, especially due to their involvement in the Yemen war and Libya in the case of the UAE. In this sense, the normalization with Israel is a big step towards this direction. Moreover, the warming relation with Israel improved the chances for arms deal between the US and the UAE, as you already mentioned. So I think this agreement between Israel and the UAE would probably affect the relations between the US and the Gulf states, especially in a very sensitive time like this.
And do you envision any time in the near future, foreseeable future, that a deal could be struck between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Is that something that's in the cards?
Yes, definitely. I must say that regarding Saudi Arabia, the kingdom is sitting on the fence and waiting to see how things turn out. At the same time, it's quite obvious that Saudi Arabia is on the way to sign an agreement with Israel. I wouldn't call it a peace agreement, but it would probably be some kind of normalization agreement. Even if it would take a while, is this normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel would be the same as the normalization agreement between the UAE and Israel? Who knows? The important thing, as I see it, is the declaration of normalization per se. Less important is what actually written in the agreement.
Could this agreement between Israel and the UAE have taken place without the acquiescence of Saudi Arabia?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear you. Sorry.
I said, could this agreement between Israel and the UAE have taken place without the acquiescence of Saudi Arabia?
Definitely not. Quite sure that Saudi Arabia actually helped to this agreement to help to the warming relations between the UAE and Israel. And I think that the next step would be a peace agreement between Israel and Bahrain, Israel and Oman, and then Saudi Arabia might sign some kind of agreement between Israel, but it doesn't really matter because we are quite sure that this is going to happen in the near future. If I may say something about the citizens in the Gulf, I think it's extremely important if you talk about the Saudi citizens and the UAE citizens. In the case of the Gulf states citizens, people are expected to hate Israel, but some of them just don't, because they don't remember Israel through wars compared to the Jordanian citizens or the Egyptian citizens. And they know Israel by the social networks, by famous actresses like Gal Gadot, by famous singers like Sarit Haddad. So they live in some kind of internal conflict. What do I mean by that? They are expected to hate Israel, but they simply don't. In this context, I would like to share with you an amazing episode that I experienced last summer. I lectured in a European university, and many of my students were citizens from Arab states. One of them was a brilliant Iraqi student. He's very well informed regarding Israel. He reads all the Israeli newspaper, and he even called me to congratulate me for the decision of Tel Aviv municipality to allow public transportation on Saturday. One day during the class, I asked him, who do you define as your country's biggest enemy? Obviously, I expected he would say Iran. Why Iran? Because it's devastating effect on Iraq. To my surprise, he said that Israel is the biggest enemy of the Arab world. I couldn't believe what I just heard. How can he say that? So he said, if Israel had not been established, there would be no Iranian enemy. So when I talk about this internal conflict, this is a great example. But there is also an optimistic side. This is not an impossible obstacle. Israel should not try to change this narrative, but to accept it. Even if Israel withdraw from all the occupied territories, it would still perceived by elements in the Arab world as responsible for the suffering of the Palestinian people. So I think that we should take politics out of the equation and emphasize the good sides of Israel, its openness towards gay people, the fight against corruption, etc. And excuse me for my language, but actually the majority of the people in the Gulf states and in Israel don't give about politics. So I think there's a great chance to improve the relation between Israel and the Gulf states, not only between the leaders of the states, but also between the people themselves, because they don't live the Palestinian problem. They don't remember the wars between Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan.
Well, I wanted to ask, Israel already has two peace agreements with Arab countries, with Egypt and Jordan. But it seems to me that this last one with the UAE might actually have the most potential of developing into a warm peace, and not only a peace between governments, but between peoples of both countries, that we in Israel, as you know, have longed for many years. And I'm wondering if you could relate to that, the differences that there might be, hopefully, between the cold peace that we have with Jordan and with Egypt, and perhaps a warmer version that we could have with the UAE.
The Gulf states never fought Israel. Okay, that's a huge difference compared to Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. When I talk to people from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, they always talk about their grandfather or their father or the whatever who fought against the Israeli army. You will never hear such a thing when you speak with people from the Gulf states. They don't remember it. They don't know about it. They don't even know what is the Palestinian problem. They even never studied about it in the schools. So it's much easier to talk with them about Israel in a very attractive way. The pride parade, the singers, the Israeli food, the beaches, they don't care about the Palestinians. Even if they say that normalization with Israel is not acceptable until the Palestinian problem is solved. Okay, so what? So what? They don't really care about it. Actually, the Gulf states leaders also don't really care about the Palestinian problem. Let's be very clear about this. So I think there's a great potential to really establish warm peace between the Gulf states and Israel, and not this frozen peace that we have with Egypt and Jordan.
So you don't think that this poses any kind of domestic problem for...
It is definitely. And that's the reason we are talking about normalization and not a warm peace between Israel and the Gulf states. It's going to be step by step, and it's okay. It's definitely okay. We shouldn't push Saudi Arabia out of its limits, okay? It's a very delicate situation. It's very hard. By the way, I must say that regarding the the UAE is facing a delicate situation, as I said, in a sense that many elements in the Arab world might perceive it as a threat to the Palestinian problem. As a result, the UAE is creating a new narrative. Not only did we not betray the Palestinian cause, we in fact succeeded in suspending the annexation. So it's all about creating new narratives. You know, it's a very challenging mission, but it's not, as I said, it's not an obstacle anymore.
Let me ask Dr. Yaari. We've heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu that he believes that this accord between Israel and the UAE is actually going to make it more feasible to reach an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Do you have a view on that? Because we've been at an impasse for so long with the Palestinians. So do you think that this might move things in some way and move Israel and the Palestinians closer, despite all the rhetoric that we've heard already from the Palestinians?
If the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli leadership find it, I'll rephrase it. If the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli leadership don't want to sit on the negotiation table, that doesn't matter, okay? It takes the willingness of two sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian, in order to develop some kind of trust between the two sides. I don't think that the UAE or the Saudi Kingdom can leverage either the Palestinian or the Israelis. If the Israeli government does not want to sign any kind of agreement with the Palestinian, it won't happen.
Mm-hmm. Let me turn for a moment to one of the players in the region that plays both sides of the game here, and I'm referring to Qatar. We know that they have been funding the Hamas in Gaza.
Yes.
And other things. How do they fit into the equation at this point?
I think there's a great potential for relations between Israel and Qatar. Qatar has a very pragmatic foreign policy. Qatar wants to improve its relation with Israel. Qatar wants to improve its relation with Israel in order to change the perspective of the US administration. And you can see it very clearly in the last 4 or 5 years. Qatar has made a tremendous change in its policy towards Israel. I think Qatar is a key player in reducing the chances for a military confrontation between Israel and Hamas. And I hopefully the next step will be warming relations between Israel and Qatar, not only regarding the Palestinian issue, but other issues as well, such as the economic issue, the climate crisis issue, the water management issue, etc., etc. And I think there's a great potential for that.
And you think that could happen despite the relationship between Qatar and Hamas, Qatar and Turkey, that in such conflict with Israel?
As I see it, the relations between Hamas and Qatar has changed dramatically since 2014. And if you talk with the Qatari envoy to Gaza, he has great connections with highly regarded figures in the Israeli administrations, such as Poli Mordechai, okay? He visits him every time he comes to Gaza. And he would tell you that he would not, I'll say it in a different way. I think that the Qatari envoy to Gaza knows that he should improve the relations with Israel and decrease the relations with Hamas, because it harms the Qatari interests in the region.
Okay, well, I'm going to add, this is my last question. I want to bring us back to the condition that we're all living in the coronavirus, and ask whether you've noticed that the pandemic has affected the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states in any particular way. I mean, for example, sharing medical knowledge, has it brought the region closer? Has it made Israel more trustworthy in the eyes of the Gulf states? Has that had at all any impact?
Definitely. It's just reflected that we all share the same challenges. And by the way, if I may, I just would like to add something about the advantages for Israel from this normalization agreement. Is it okay with you?
Sure.
Okay, so first, Israel's strategy, and you mentioned before, Israel's strategy has always been to develop relations with Arab states with which it has no diplomatic relation. And in this sense, the agreement with the UAE is a great success, especially, by the way, in cooperating regarding the corona. Secondly, Israel places great importance on the economic cooperation. We didn't mention it yet, and not just its strategic cooperation with the Gulf states. The economic potential of such normalization is huge. If the Gulf market opens its door for Israeli companies and products, the sky is the limit. There are voices in Israel who say that the Gulf states needs us more than we needs them, especially in the strategic aspect. It might be the case, although I disagree, but in the economic aspect, there is no doubt that the Israeli economy would benefit from the cooperation. The economic cooperation might actually change the Israeli economy. That means that we have to look at the agreement in a holistic way. Both sides are winning. That's a win-win situation, and that must be in order for this agreement to be a long-lasting agreement, and I hope that we all want this to happen.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to end on that positive note. I want to thank Dr. Michal Yaari for being with us today and sharing her insights on the Israel-Gulf relations in light of the historic Abraham Accord. A recording of this panel conversation will be available on demand on your YouTube channel shortly. I also want to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope that you will be coming back for future discussions. Until then, take care and continue to be well. We'll see you again soon.